Hey everyone, and welcome back to part 3 of today's lecture series on the natural world. In this section, I'm going to be talking a little bit more about the way that those latent anxieties we saw in some of the Augustan art, like the wild tangle beyond the wall in the Prima Porta garden paintings, or the overwhelming dwarfing landscape features with very small mythological characters situated within them from those mythological paintings of the Augustan period. That idea that the natural world sort of has a danger to it, has an unpredictability and an uncontrollability, becomes more prominent even in art of the imperial apparatus a little bit later on past the Augustan period. One reason that this might happen, and I'm sure that there are many alternate explanations, is the way that different relationships with the natural world take on different connotations also in the literary sphere. So let's return to Augustus for a second here. Augustus is an example of a ruler who has a very good relationship with the natural world. He is shown as someone who has a sort of care for the natural world, who's very pious, and that is reflective of his personality in his sort of historical tradition, in the way that historians write about Emperor Augustus. So one story that shows up is this tale that one day he exits from his house on the Palatine Hill in Rome, and he sees a palm shoot has flourished overnight, sprouted up between the flagstones sort of on the threshold of his house, so a place where a plant shouldn't be growing. And Augustus responds to this not by, weeding or anything like that, but by actually carefully transplanting the palm shoot within the courtyard of the house, close to his household gods, where it can grow and flourish, so it becomes a sort of sign of his dynasty, a sign of his longevity, a sign of his piety and good relationship with the natural world and the forces behind it, the gods behind it as well. Livia's Laurel Grove is another example here that we saw before. Lots of the history of Augustus in this period pertains to the way in which he has a very good relationship with plants, has a bit of a green thumb. And that's pretty common in some of our good ruler relationships. Bad rulers, on the other hand, often get associated with nature in a different way. If they are overly hubristic, for example, arguments with the natural world tend to be a way in which the literary record represents their inability to understand where to stop. So one example is Xerxes. Here we have an illustration. During the Persian invasion of Greece, Xerxes bridged the Hellespont, the little piece of water that stretches between Europe and Asia on the border in Turkey. And Xerxes, the first time he built a bridge on the Hellespont, there was a storm which then destroyed the bridge, so he was absolutely pissed off. And he had his men lash the waves and whip them and throw chains in to sort of show his displeasure, and then he bridged the Hellespont with pontoon boats. And then Emperor Caligula, a few hundred years later, shows up. He's the third emperor in the Augustan line and not a very good one. He also did something similar. He conquered the ocean in Britain by having his men collect seashells to show in a Roman triumph. And then he also built a bridge across part of the Bay of Naples of 3 miles of pontoon boats, much like Xerxes, in order to sort of have a triumph across the waves and show his ability to conquer the natural world. So there's a sort of balance, right? So a good leader is shown as having a cooperative, fruitful relationship with nature, and a bad leader has a more contentious relationship with the natural world, one in which they don't really understand their limits in the way that one should be sort of cautious in the way that you treat nature because of its ability to turn against you. So oftentimes when we see historical presentation of leaders from the third person, we have a way that the writer is using the representation of a leader's relationship with the natural world to say something about their leadership style as well. Are they sort of a dictator-y type, or are they more a good leader? And that, isn't necessarily a representation of reality, but is very much something that shows up in these subjective historical records. So another literary piece that comes in here that I think is really interesting and worth talking about are the ways in which trees in particular and other forms of nature take on a sort of semi-sentient status, making them almost equivalent to slaves. So they are not, they don't have agency exactly, right? Much like a slave in this time period would be a piece of property. But they are alive enough to sort of count as something worth taking over. So in this section of Pliny's Natural History, we have a story about how in the Judean Wars of about 70 CE, Titus and Vespasian actually at the conclusion of that war bring back a really valuable tree, the balsam tree, which is difficult to grow. It is geographically limited in where it comes from, and it is is the source of a really expensive unguent and incense and balm and things like that, right? So the balsam tree is sort of a high status object. And in this story, after the conquest of Judea, it becomes one of the pieces of booty that is brought back to Rome to show that conquest and to sort of display the fruits of that conquest for the people back in the city, back at home. So in this case, Pliny very explicitly says this tree is now a slave. It pays tribute together with its race, i.e. the Jews in this case. Now it is in the public treasury that grows it. It is the public treasury that grows up, and never before was it more plentiful, though its height remains under 2 cubits, quite short. So in this case, this tree and its flourishing in the city of Rome, despite all odds, despite the fact that it never grows on its own outside of Judea, also becomes a symbol for the way that sort of peoples become absorbed into the Roman Empire. And while they may not grow on their own in the patterns that they're used to anymore, everyone flourishes under Rome, of course, right? That's the sort of message that we want to show here. So trees could sort of be semi-sentient. They have an almost human status oftentimes. And we see that sort of coming through again and again in different ways. Now, if we turn to self-presentation and the way that emperors really self-present their relationship with the natural world, looking back, for example, at Trajan's column here, we have that emphasis on both the way that Roman engineering, especially in the realm of warfare, is a way of reshaping the environment, conquering the environment, but always, in many cases, with the approval of the environment itself. A real emphasis, again, on harmony, on harmoniousness in that relationship. So at the base of Trajan's column, which really shows a lot of scenes in which the landscape of Dacia is transformed into a recognizably Roman space, as we read about in Elizabeth Wolfram Phil's article. It starts out with the god of the river assenting to the crossing of the Roman troops, right? Sort of giving his approval to their movement through the space that had been bounded by his authority. So we have that. We have other scenes, so many scenes in which the forest plays an important role, the cutting down of trees to build forts, the creating easier movement through the space, really urbanizing the space and making it more of a place where nature is in service to human needs rather than a more unpredictable force. We also see that sort of tendency to use the forest as a space of refuge, as a space of danger, and in this case, that final climactic scene in which Decebalus is killed, or kills himself rather, while pursued by Trajan's troops at the end of the Second Dacian conflict, takes place here in a forest that is no longer sort of sheltering the Dacians from the Romans. And we see also a record in Pliny the Elder, the writer of the Natural History's nephew's letters, Pliny the Younger here, where he writes to a friend who has recently written a poem about the Dacian War. And he too really emphasizes the fact that this Dacian conflict should be told in terms of its relationship with the natural world. So we have Pliny saying, "You will sing of rivers turned into new channels, and rivers bridged for the first time, of camps pitched upon craggy mountains, and of a king superior to adversity," that's Decebalus in this case, though forced to abandon his capital city and even his life. So we have a sort of link here between that landscape and the sort of craggy, difficult landscape of Dacia and this king himself, who is a very tough, adverse enemy. Both the landscape and the peoples ruled by that king coming into harmony under Rome in the ideal sense. This is now all of us together. We've taken over. Rome is going to take care of both the landscape and its people. If we look at the later column of Marcus Aurelius, we already see a little bit of a difference here. We talked a bit before about the more plebeian style of the column of Marcus Aurelius, the way that we see stockier figures, deeper relief, a little bit more abstraction in some of the way that elements are represented here. And we have also a greater emphasis, despite the same sort of beginning where the river god ascents to the crossing of the Romans, a greater emphasis on miracles of nature. So we have our rain miracle, this really famous scene in which the German tribes that the Romans are fighting against are drowned by this sudden storm, and the Romans who were dehydrating themselves to death were suddenly saved by the same storm. So there's a little bit more of an emphasis in this later victory column on the way that the natural world and its unpredictability also helps the Romans. We still have that cooperative aspect, but it puts a little bit more agency into the realm of nature. Rather than simple ascent, there is a sort of active helping of the Roman troops on the part of the environment of the German territories, in addition to the environment being very frightening and with lots of forests and things like that. As a difficult space for the Romans to be in. Another example that shows up a lot in these sort of imperial moments of engineering prowess that we need to celebrate our conquest over nature and the ascent of nature for our conquest over it, shows up in a poem written by Statius about Domitian, Emperor Domitian's building of a bridge. And in this case, Statius actually takes on the voice of the river that is bridged here, the Vulturnus, and thanks the emperor. I give thee thanks, and my servitude to you as the imperial ruler of the empire is worth the while, because under thy rule and at thy command I have yielded, and because thou wilt be read of perpetually as supreme lord and conqueror of my bank. So the river itself taking on this voice here through the poet and speaking directly to the emperor, assenting to the imperial control over the resource. So the idea is that sort of the natural world for the imperial state is a way of showing their power. Because Roman engineering was such an important piece of both military and civic life, we see that the relationship with the natural world is one that is frequently evoked both by poets and by builders, as we see on Trajan's column with the inscription about the amount of earth that has been removed to build it. It becomes a really important theme. It's on the mind of these imperial people. Right, so with that, what I want you to do is just to write 2 to 3 sentences on how you would interpret the image of the natural world that you chose from your Pompeian house. These are just some questions you might think about answering. Is the image more naturalistic or abstract? Is it incorporated into a larger scene of nature? Is it in a different kind of composition? Is it part of an architectural frame maybe? What is the scale? Is it asymmetrical or symmetrical? And how does the relationship stand between the image and where it is in the house? Is it in a garden space? Is it removed? Just some of those kinds of questions, a brief little interpretation of the image of nature that you discovered.